Sometimes justice isn't blind, it's betrayed. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 3B hummed overhead as Judge Patricia Morrison adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. The packed room fell silent. Reporters gripped their pens, family members held their breath, and Officer Claire Dalton stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her German Shepherd K9 partner Rex sitting perfectly still at her side. In the case of the state versus Officer Claire Dalton, Judge Morrison's voice echoed through the chamber on the charge of first-degree murder. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. The gavel struck with a sharp crack that seemed to split the air itself. Chaos erupted. Claire's defense attorney pumped his fist. Reporters scrambled for their phones, and Claire's mother sobbed tears of relief from the gallery. But amid the celebration, something strange happened. Rex didn't move, not even an ear. Twitch. Claire dropped to one knee beside her partner, tears streaming down her face. "We did it, boy. We're going home." She reached to stroke his head, but Rex remained rigid, his dark eyes fixed on something across the courtroom. The old wooden evidence box. Detective Sarah Harris, who had worked the case alongside Claire, noticed it too. Rex's intense stare, the way his nostrils flared slightly, the almost imperceptible growl rumbling in his chest. She'd worked with K9 units for 15 years. She knew that look. It was the same expression Rex wore when he'd found contraband during drug raids or located missing persons in the wilderness. It was the look of a dog who had found something important. "Rex?" Claire's voice carried a hint of confusion as she tugged gently on his leash. "Come on, buddy, let's go." But Rex planted his paws and refused to budge. His gaze never wavered from the evidence box, where the supposed murder weapon, a bloodied kitchen knife, had been stored throughout the trial. The courtroom began to empty, but Rex's behavior had caught the attention of several. Observers' whispers began to circulate. "What's wrong with the dog? Why won't he leave? Dogs can sense things. You know." Claire's attorney, Marcus Webb, a sharp-dressed man with silver hair, approached with concern etched on his face. "Claire, we need to get you out of here. The media circus is just beginning." "He won't move," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled harder on the leash, but Rex remained unmoved, his body language speaking volumes to those who knew how to read. Court. Jenny Rodriguez, who had been organizing the evidence, approached cautiously. "Officer Dalton, is your K9 all right? He seems distressed." Detective Harris stepped forward, her instincts screaming that something wasn't. "Rex has been with Claire for 4 years. I've never seen him act like this. He's probably just tired," Claire said quickly, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "It's been a long trial, a lot of stress for both of us." But Harris wasn't convinced. She'd testified as a character witness, for Claire had vouched for her integrity and professionalism. Claire was decorated Officer of the Year twice, commendations for bravery, an exemplary service record spanning 8 years. The prosecution's case had been circumstantial at best. A knife found near the scene with Claire's fingerprint? Yes, but she'd been first responder. Of course, her prints would be. Her alibi for the time of death was she'd been at the precinct filing reports. The victim, Marcus Delacroix, had been a small-time informant with a drug problem and a long list of enemies. Claire's tears on the witness stand had been genuine. Her pain at being accused real and wrong. The jury had bought it complete. So why wouldn't Rex leave the evidence box? "Maybe we should call animal control," suggested the bailiff, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez. "Get the dog checked." "No," Harris said firmly, crouching down to Rex's. The German Shepherd turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Desperate. "Rex, what is it? What do you say?" Rex whined softly, then turned back to the evidence box. He took a step, then another, until Claire was forced to follow or let go of the leash. "This is ridiculous," Claire murmured. But there was something in her tone, a tightness, a note of panic, that made Harris's cop instincts. The evidence box sat on a table near the prosecutor's chin, its contents having been displayed and examined countless times during the trial. The murder weapon, crime scene, photos, the victim's personal effects, all of it had been picked apart by both. Rex approached the box slowly, deliberately. When he sat in perfect position and stared up at her, but could only be described as accusation. The remaining people in the courtroom, a handful of reporters, court staff, and Claire's legal, watched in stunned silence as the trained police dog seemed to be making some kind of "This is insane," Claire said, her voice rising. "He's a dog. He doesn't understand what happened." But Rex understood more than anyone realized. He understood the scent of fear that had clung to Claire for weeks. He understood the smell of that never quite washed out of her uniform despite multiple. Most importantly, he understood the scent that emanated from the evidence, scent that connected to something his handler had hidden. Judge Morrison, who had been preparing to leave, paused at the door. "Is there a No, Your Honor," Attorney Webb said. "We were just—" Rex suddenly stood and barked once, sharp, and it was his alert bark, the sound he made when he'd found what he was looking for. In the confined space of the courtroom, it sounded like a... Everyone jumped, except Claire, who went very... "Perhaps," Judge Morrison said, "we should clear the courtroom and let Officer Dalton deal with her K9. People began to... Detective Harris. Something about this whole scene. She'd been a cop too long to ignore the feeling. "Claire," she said, "is everything?" Claire looked at her friend, the woman who had testified on her behalf, who had vouched for her. "Everything fine, Sarah. Rex is just... This whole ordeal has been hard on you." But as spoke, Rex had moved to the evidence box and was now actively sniffing around its base, his tail rigid, his entire body language screaming that he'd found something. And Harris made a decision that would haunt her for weeks. "I'm going to trust you on there. But if you need anything, call." McClellan nodded, relief flooding her. "Thank you, Sarah, for..." As the courtroom finally, Claire was left alone with Rex and the evidence. The building seemed to echo with the weight of what had just transpired, a declaration of innocence that should have felt them. It felt like the beginning of something more. Rex turned to look at his handler one time, his intelligent eyes holding a knowledge that made Claire's blood boil. In a moment, she realized that while she might have fooled a jury of 12, convinced a judge, and swayed public opinion, she would never fool the one witness who the one witness who had been with her that night, the one witness who would never stop seeking justice. As Claire finally managed to coax Rex away from the evidence box, neither of them noticed the small piece of fabric that had been disturbed during Rex's investigation, a tiny fragment that would later prove to be the thread that unraveled everything. The courtroom doors closed behind them with a soft click, but the echo seemed to reverberate forever, like the sound of justice deferred, but not denied. The media circus began before Claire even reached the courthouse steps. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, microphones thrust forward like weapons, and reporters shouted questions over each other in a cacophony that made her head spin. "Officer Dalton, how does it feel to be vindicated? Do you plan to sue the department for wrongful prosecution? What's next for you and your K9 partner?" Claire's attorney, Marcus Webb, guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, his silver hair gleaming under the television lights. "No comments at this time," he repeated like a mantra. "Officer Dalton is looking forward to returning to her life and serving her community." But Rex made their passage difficult. Instead of walking alongside Claire, as he'd been trained to do for 4 years, he kept turning back toward the courthouse, pulling against his leash with a determination that bordered on desperation. Each tug sent a spike of anxiety through Claire's chest. "Easy, Rex," she murmured, but her voice came out strained and artificial. Several reporters noticed the interaction. "Is your K9 having trouble adjusting to the stress of the trial?" called out Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7. Newsall, "Dogs react differently to high-pressure situations." Webb answered smoothly, "Rex has been incredibly loyal throughout this ordeal." Finally, they reached Claire's pickup truck. She opened the rear door, expecting Rex to jump in, as he had countless times before. Instead, he sat down on the concrete and refused to move. Rex, come. The command was sharp, authoritative, the voice of a police officer used to immediate obedience. But Rex simply stared at her, his dark eyes reflecting something that made her stomach clench. Having some trouble there. Officer, the voice belonged to Detective Mike Castellanos, a colleague from her precinct who had been following the case closely. He approached with his hands in his pockets, a concerned expression on his weathered face. "He's just tired," Claire said, forcing a smile. It's been a long few months, but Castellanos had worked with K9 units. He knew what a traumatized dog looked like, and this wasn't it. Rex appeared alert, focused, like he was on duty. "You know, my brother-in-law runs a veterinary practice, specializes in working dogs. Maybe Rex should have a checkup. Make sure the stress hasn't affected his health." "That's not necessary," Claire replied too quickly. "I know my partner." Eventually, with Webb's help, they managed to get Rex into the truck. But throughout the 30-minute drive to Claire's suburban home, the German Shepherd paced restlessly in the back seat, whining and pawing at the windows. Whenever they passed the police station, Claire's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by mature oak trees that provided privacy from curious neighbors. It was a modest two-bedroom home she'd bought with her police salary, complete with a large fenced backyard, perfect for a working dog. As soon as they arrived, Rex bolted from the truck and ran straight to the back gate, scratching at it frantically. He needs to burn off some energy. Claire explained to Webb, who was helping her carry in mail that had accumulated during the trial. Being cooped up in that courtroom for weeks, but her voice trailed off as she watched Rex through the kitchen window. He wasn't running around the yard or playing with his toys as he normally would. Instead, he was digging near the garden shed, his powerful legs throwing dirt in all directions. Chebtu Anfo followed her gaze. "Maybe you should bring him inside." The last thing you need is nosy neighbors wondering what he's doing. That evening, Claire tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. She heated up a frozen dinner, opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for her exoneration, and settled into her favorite chair to watch the news coverage of her trial. Rex usually claimed the spot on the couch beside her during their evening routine. Tonight, he positioned himself across the room, watching her with an intensity that made the food turn to ash in her mouth. "Rex?" She patted the couch cushion. "Come here, boy." The dog tilted his head, but didn't move. The lead story on the evening news was her trial complete, with footage of her tearful testimony and emotional reaction to the verdict. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, spoke in grave tones about the challenges facing law enforcement officers and the importance of due process. Officer Claire Dalton's ordeal highlights the difficult position police officers find themselves in when accusations arise, the reporter said. Her exemplary service record and emotional testimony clearly resonated with the jury. Claire reached for her wine glass, but her hand was shaking so badly that she knocked it over red wine spreading across the coffee table like blood. Rex stood up immediately, alert and tense. "It's okay," Claire said, more to herself than to the dog. "Everything's okay now." But as she cleaned up the spill, she could feel Rex's eyes on her, and she knew that nothing would ever be okay again. The next morning brought a stream of visitors. Fellow officers stopped by to offer congratulations and support. Claire's mother drove down from Portland with casseroles and tearful hugs. Neighbors who had maintained polite distance during the trial suddenly found reasons to drop by with flowers and well wishes. Through it all, Rex remained aloof and agitated. He refused his favorite treats, turned away from colleagues who had previously been his friends, and spent most of his time in the backyard, digging holes and whining softly. Maybe he needs some time to decompress, suggested Officer Janet Reeves, Claire's former patrol partner. Dogs are more sensitive to stress than people realize. But Detective Sarah Harris, who stopped by on her third day home, had a different perspective. "I've been thinking about Rex's behavior in the courtroom," Harris said, settling into a kitchen chair with a cup of coffee. "I've worked with a lot of K-9 units over the years." "That wasn't stress?" Behavior. Claire's hand tightened around her mug. "What do you mean?" "He was alerting to something. The way he focused on that evidence box. It was like he'd found contraband during a search." "That's impossible," Claire said. "There was nothing in that box but the murder weapon and some personal effects from the victim." Harris nodded slowly. "I know, that's what's bothering me." They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, watching Rex through the window. He was once again digging near the shed, his behavior obsessive and determined. Claire Harris said carefully, "Is there anything you want to tell me? Anything about that night that maybe didn't come out in the trial?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Claire met her friend's eyes, and for a moment Harris thought she saw something flicker there. A shadow of guilt, maybe, or fear. "There's nothing to tell," Claire said finally. "I was at the station filing reports. You know that. You checked the logs yourself." "I did," Harris agreed. "But Rex doesn't seem to know that." That night, Claire lay awake listening to Rex pace the hallway outside her bedroom. His nails clicked against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Every few minutes he would stop and whine softly, a sound that cut through her like a knife. At 3 a.m. she heard him scratching at something. She crept to her bedroom door and peered out to find Rex clawing at her closet door, the same closet where her blood-stained uniform had been stored during the investigation. "Rex! No!" she hissed, grabbing his collar and pulling him away. The dog looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her blood freeze. It wasn't confusion or stress or trauma from the trial, it was disappointment. The kind of look a loyal partner gives when they realize they've been betrayed. Claire sank to the floor beside him, her hands shaking as she stroked his fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But Rex pulled away from her touch and padded back to his spot in the hallway, where he would spend the rest of the night watching. Her door standing guard not to protect her, but to keep watch on her. In the morning, Claire would find 3 more holes in her backyard, each one precisely located over spots where she had buried evidence that the police had never found. Evidence that Rex remembered even if he couldn't speak. Evidence that would eventually speak for itself. Detective Sarah Harris couldn't sleep. For the 4th night in a row, she found herself sitting at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. surrounded by copies of the Delacroix case files. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she kept sipping it anyway, her eyes burning as she pored over witness statements, forensic reports, and crime scene photographs. Everything about the case had seemed straightforward. Marcus Delacroix, a small-time drug informant with a history of paranoia and violence, had been found stabbed to death in an alley behind Murphy's bar. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the victim's own apartment, had been discovered near the scene with Officer Claire Dalton's fingerprints on it, but Claire had been first responder. Of course, her prints would be on it. Her alibi was rock solid. Harris had personally checked the logs. Claire had been at the precinct that night, filing reports and catching. Up on paperwork, security cameras confirmed her presence from 8 p.m. until nearly midnight. Delacroix's time of death was estimated between 9 and 11 p.m. The prosecution had argued that Claire killed Delacroix to silence him, that the informant had threatened to expose police corruption. But they couldn't prove motive, couldn't place her at the scene, and couldn't overcome her spotless reputation and emotional testimony. The jury had made the right decision. So why did Harris feel like she was missing something? Her phone buzzed with a text message from her partner, Detective Ray Kowalski. "Still up?" "Saw your light on." Harris looked out her window and waved at the house across the street. A moment later, Ray appeared at her back door in a bathrobe and slippers, carrying 2 steaming mugs decaf, he said, setting one down in front of her. "And before you ask, yes, my wife sent it. She's worried about you. I can't let this go." Ray Kowalski, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and kind eyes, settled into the chair. Across from her, he'd been her partner for 6 years, and knew her well enough to recognize when she was spiraling. "The case is closed. Sarah Claire was acquitted. It's time to move on. Then explain Rex's behavior to me." Harris had filled him in on what she'd witnessed in the courtroom, but Kowalski remained skeptical. Dogs have off days, just like people. Maybe the trial stressed him out. "I went by Claire's house yesterday," Harris said, pulling out her phone. "Look at this." The photo showed Claire's backyard, scarred with more than a dozen holes. Some were shallow, others deep enough to hide a body. Rex could be seen in the background, his snout covered in dirt, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's range. "Jesus," Kowalski muttered. "What's he looking for?" "That's what I want to know." Harris had asked Claire about the holes, had even offered to help fill them in. But Claire had brushed off her concerns, claiming Rex was just working through anxiety. "He'll stop when he's ready," she'd said. But the digging had only gotten worse. The next morning, Harris made a decision that would either restore her faith in her friend or destroy it completely. She called Dr. Amanda Chen, a forensic anthropologist she'd worked with on previous cases. "I need a favor," Harris said, "and it might be a little unconventional." Dr. Chen met her at Claire's house while Claire was at physical therapy, a standing appointment she'd maintained since the trial ended. They didn't have long. "You want me to examine holes dug by a dog?" Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow as they stood in Claire's backyard. I want to know if there's any reason a trained police dog would be this obsessed with specific locations. Dr. Chen was a small woman with intelligent eyes and steady hands. She approached the largest hole, which was nearly 3 feet deep, and knelt beside it with her equipment bag. German shepherds are incredibly intelligent, she said, pulling on latex gloves. If Rex is focusing on these spots, there's probably a reason. She took soil samples from 3 different holes, sealing them in sterile containers. I can test these for biological material. Blood, decomposed tissue. Anything that might explain his behavior. How long will it take? 48 hours, if you mark it priority. That evening, Harris received an unexpected visitor. Officer Janet Reeves, Claire's former patrol partner, showed up at her door with a bottle of wine and a troubled expression. "We need to talk," Janet said. They settled on Harris's back porch, where the conversation couldn't be overheard. Janet had been Claire's partner for 2 years before transferring to the robbery division. She knew Claire better than almost anyone. "There's something I never told anyone during the trial." Janet began, her hands nervously twisting. The wine glass. "Something about the night. Marcus Delacroix died." Harris felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of something?" "Claire called me that night around 10:30. She was strange, agitated. She asked me about evidence disposal protocols, specifically how long biological evidence could be detected on clothing. Did she say why she was asking? She claimed it was for a report she was writing. But Sarah, it was nearly 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Who writes reports about evidence protocols at that hour?" Harris set down her wine glass, her mind racing. "Did you tell anyone about this?" "I thought about it. But Claire's my friend, and I didn't want to add fuel to the prosecution's fire over what might have been an innocent question." Janet, that call came right around the time of Delacroix's murder. I know Janet's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying this guilt for months. What if I was wrong to keep quiet?" The next morning brought Dr. Chen's preliminary results. Harris met her at the forensics lab, her stomach churning with anticipation and dread. "The soil samples are interesting," Dr. Chen said, spreading out lab reports on her desk. "I found traces of blood in 3 of the holes. Old blood, degraded, but definitely human." "How old?" "Based on the decomposition markers, I'd estimate 3 to 4 months. Right around the time of your murder case." Harris felt the world tilt slightly. "Are you sure?" "I'm running DNA analysis now, but the preliminary tests are pretty conclusive. There's also this Dr. Chen held up an evidence bag containing what looked like a small piece of fabric. Rex uncovered this in the deepest hole. It's synthetic material, possibly from a uniform or jacket. There are bloodstains that match the samples from the soil." Harris stared at the fabric, her mind conjuring images of Claire's uniform, the one that had been examined and cleared by forensics during the investigation. "Dr. Chen, I need you to compare this blood to Marcus Delacroix's DNA already on it. Results should be available by tomorrow afternoon." That evening, Harris made one of the hardest phone calls of her career. She dialed Claire's number, her hands shaking slightly as she listened to the rings. "Sarah? Is everything okay?" Claire's voice sounded strained. Tired in the background, Harris could hear Rex whining. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." A pause. "Of course. Did you bury anything in your backyard? Anything connected to the Delacroix case?" The silence stretched, so long that Harris thought the call might have dropped. "Claire, are you there?" "Why would you ask me that?" "Because Rex found blood." Claire human blood, and fabric that looks like it came from a police uniform. Another long pause. When Claire spoke again, her voice had changed, become flat, emotionless. "I think you should talk to my lawyer before we continue this conversation." The line went dead. Harris sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone, feeling the last of her faith in her friend crumble like sand. Outside her window, the night seemed darker than usual, filled with shadows that looked like secrets waiting to be exposed. She had 48 hours to decide whether to officially reopen the case or to let sleeping dogs lie. But as she thought about Rex's desperate behavior, his refusal to let the evidence rest, she realized the decision had already been made. Justice might have been blind in the courtroom, but it had 4 legs and a cold nose, and it wasn't going to stay buried forever. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring. Detective Sarah Harris, from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. Dr. Amanda Chen's voice was tense, professional, and laden with the weight of revelation. "Sarah, you need to get down here. Now the DNA results, just come and bring backup." Harris dressed, quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. As she drove through the early morning darkness toward the forensics lab, she tried to prepare herself for what she might learn. But nothing could have readied her for the bombshell Dr. Chen was about to drop. "It's a match," Dr. Chen said, without preamble, holding up the lab report. "The blood on the fabric and in the soil samples belongs to Marcus Delacroix." Harris sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal settling over her like a shroud. "You're certain?" "Absolutely." "But that's not all." Dr. Chen pulled out additional evidence bags. "The fabric is from a police uniform, specifically the type worn by your department. The blood patterns suggest it was heavily saturated, then buried while still damp." "How much blood are we talking about?" "Enough to indicate the person wearing this uniform was present during a violent altercation. Possibly the primary scene." Harris felt sick. All those character references she'd provided, all the testimony about Claire's integrity and professionalism. It had all been lies, built on lies. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "I found something else Rex dug up." She held up a small plastic evidence bag containing what looked like a jewelry chain. "It's gold-plated, with traces of blood and skin tissue. I cross-referenced it with the victim's personal effects. Inventory." Harris recognized it immediately. "Delacroix's necklace. The one that was listed as missing from the scene. The same. And before you ask, I already ran prints. There are partials, but they're too degraded for a positive match." Within 2 hours, Harris had assembled a team. Detective Ray Kowalski, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, and 2 officers from Internal Affairs. They also brought a warrant, not for arrest, not yet, but for a comprehensive search of Claire Dalton's property. Claire was waiting for them when they arrived, standing in her front yard, with Rex at her side. She was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater, but she carried herself with the rigid posture of an officer under review. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Detective Harris," she said formally, "I assume this isn't a social." Call Harris approached slowly, aware that every word would be scrutinized. Later, in court. "Claire, we have a warrant to search your property. We've found evidence that suggests I know what you've found." Claire's voice was steady, but Harris could see her hands trembling slightly. Rex made sure of that, as if summoned by his name. Rex moved to position, himself between Claire and the search team. But instead of the protective stance they might have expected, the German Shepherd sat facing Claire. his dark eyes fixed on her with unmistakable accusation. Lieutenant Rivera stepped forward with the warrant. "Officer Dalton, we're going to need you to step aside while we conduct our search. Am I under arrest?" "Not at this time, but I'd recommend you contact your attorney." The search took 4 hours. In addition to the evidence Rex had already uncovered, they found Claire's backup service weapon hidden in a locked box beneath her bedroom floorboards. A weapon that should have been turned in to the department armory months ago. Ballistics would later confirm it hadn't been fired recently, but its concealment raised serious questions. They also discovered something that chilled Harris to the bone: a detailed map of the city's surveillance camera locations with specific routes marked in red ink routes that would allow someone to travel from Claire's house to Murphy's bar without being recorded. But perhaps most damning was Claire's computer. Forensic analysis revealed searches conducted in the weeks before Delacroix's murder. How long does DNA survive in soil police evidence disposal protocols? And can dogs be trained to forget scents as the search progressed? Rex became increasingly agitated. He paced the yard, whining and pawing at areas the team hadn't yet excavated. When Officer Martinez began digging in a new location, Rex barked sharply and ran to the spot, sitting in perfect alert position. "He's showing us something else," Martinez said, continuing to dig. 20 minutes later, his shovel hit something solid. "Got it." It was a small metal box buried 2 feet deep and wrapped in plastics. Inside, they found what would become the final nail in Claire Dalton's coffin: Marcus Delacroix's cell phone. Its screen cracked, but data intact. Harris felt her legs go weak as she examined the phone's message history. The last text, sent at 9:23 p.m. on the night of his murder, was to Claire's personal number. "I won't stay quiet anymore. Meet me behind Murphy's, or I tell them everything." Claire's response, sent 4 minutes later: "On my way." The timeline that had seemed to exonerate her was suddenly in question. If she'd left the police station through the back exit, the one without security cameras, she could have made the drive to Murphy's bar in 15 minutes. Claire Harris said, approaching where her former friend stood under the watchful eye of an internal affairs officer. "Is there anything you want to tell us?" For a moment, Claire's carefully maintained composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at Rex, who hadn't left his position facing her. "He won't even look at me anymore," she whispered. 4 years as partners, and now he won't even look at me. "Dogs." "No," Harris said softly. "They can sense guilt, fear, deception. Rex has been trying to tell us the truth all along." Claire was quiet for a long moment, watching, as the search team continued to process evidence from her backyard. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Marcus was going to ruin everything. Not just for me, but for half the department. He had evidence of evidence tampering payoffs, planted drugs, he was paranoid and unstable, and no one would have believed him except he had proof." Claire nodded. "Photos, recordings, documentation going back 2 years. He wanted money to keep quiet, and when I wouldn't pay, he threatened to go to internal affairs. So you killed him. I didn't mean for it to happen. I went to meet him to try to reason with him, but he laughed at me, said I was just as dirty as the rest of them. We struggled, and she gestured helplessly. The knife was his. He pulled it first." Harris felt a mixture of relief and revulsion. Relief that the truth was finally coming out. Revulsion at what her friend had become. "The uniform you were wearing that night. You buried it in your backyard. Rex was with me. He saw everything. I thought if I got rid of the evidence, If I could just make it disappear, Claire's voice broke. But he remembered. Dogs don't forget, as if he understood he was being discussed. Rex stood and walked slowly toward Claire. For a moment, Harris thought, the dog might finally forgive. His handler might offer some gesture of comfort. Instead, Rex sat down directly in front of Claire and began to bark. Not the sharp, alert bark they'd heard before, but a sustained, mournful howl that seemed to echo with accusation and betrayal. He's telling everyone what really happened, Claire said, tears streaming down her face. He's the only honest cop. Left, Lieutenant? Rivera stepped forward with handcuffs. Claire Dalton, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus. Delacroix, you have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights were read, Rex's howling gradually subsided. He watched as his former partner was placed in the back of a patrol car. His expression unreadable, but his message clear: justice had finally been served. But as the car pulled away, Rex didn't follow. Instead, he walked over to Detective Harris and sat beside her. His duty complete, but his loyalty forever changed. The dog that had refused to stay silent had finally been heard. 3 months after Claire Dalton's arrest, the Riverside County Courthouse was once again packed to capacity. But this time the atmosphere was different, charged with anticipation rather than sympathy, filled with whispers of betrayal rather than support. Detective Sarah Harris sat in the gallery watching as her former friend was led into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. Claire had lost weight during her incarceration, her once proud bearing replaced by the hunched shoulders of defeat. At Harris's feet, Rex lay calmly wearing a new collar that identified him as a working police dog. The transition hadn't been easy. The German Shepherd had spent weeks in a specialized rehabilitation program, working with trainers who understood the psychological trauma of betrayal by a handler. But Rex was resilient, and more importantly, he was ready to serve again. The prosecution's case was ironclad. Claire's confession, recorded and witnessed, had been followed by a treasure trove of evidence. Uncovered by investigators, Marcus Delacroix's phone had revealed not just the incriminating text exchange, but also recordings of conversations that exposed a web of corruption within the police department. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez stood before the jury with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. Ladies and gentlemen, this case represents the worst kind of betrayal. Not just of a victim, but of the public trust officer. Claire Dalton didn't just take a life. She perverted the very system she swore to protect. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from a traffic camera 2 blocks from Murphy's Bar showed Claire's personal vehicle driving toward the scene at 9:31 p.m., 8 minutes after she'd supposedly left the police station to go home. The blood-stained uniform, Delacroix's missing necklace, the carefully planned route to avoid surveillance. It painted a picture of premeditated murder disguised as self-defense. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. The state calls Detective Sarah Harris to the stand. Harris rose slowly, aware that every eye in the courtroom was on her. As she walked to the witness stand, Rex lifted his head, watching her with the same intelligent eyes that had first recognized the truth. Months ago, Detective Harris D.A. Martinez began. You've known the defendant for how long? 6 years. We worked together, attended the same training seminars. I considered her a friend, and you testified on her behalf. During her first trial, Harris's voice was steady, but laden with regret. I did. I believed in her innocence completely. What changed your mind? Harris glanced at Rex, who had been allowed to remain in the courtroom as a witness, her K-9 partner, Rex's behavior. In the courtroom that day was unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of working with police dogs. He was trying to tell us something. The prosecutor guided Harris through the timeline of discovery. The soil samples, the DNA evidence, Rex's persistent digging that had uncovered the truth. With each revelation, Claire seemed to shrink further into herself, Detective Harris. In your professional opinion, how significant was Rex's role in solving this case? Rex was the only witness who couldn't be fooled, bribed, or intimidated. While the rest of us were focused on alibis and evidence that could be manipulated, he was responding to what he knew to be true. Dogs don't lie, and they don't forget. Rex remembered the scent of blood on his handler's uniform, the location where evidence was buried, the guilt and fear that had changed his partner's behavior. Claire's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named James Morton, did his best during cross-examination, but there was little he could do to counter the mountain of evidence or the compelling narrative of a loyal dog exposing his handler's crimes. Detective Harris Morton said, "Isn't it possible that Rex's behavior was simply the result of trauma from the trial and media attention?" No, Sir Rex exhibited specific alert behaviors, the same responses he'd been trained to show when locating contraband or evidence. This wasn't stress or confusion. This was a working dog doing his job. The trial lasted 5 days. Expert witnesses testified about canine behavior. Forensic anthropologists explained the significance of the buried evidence, and digital forensic specialists walked the jury through the damning cell phone records, but it was the victim impact statement that truly drove home the gravity of Claire's betrayal. Marcus Delacroix's sister, Maria, took the stand on the final day. She was a small woman with her brother's dark eyes, and her voice shook as she addressed the court. "My brother was troubled. Yes, he made mistakes, struggled with addiction, got involved with the wrong people. But he was trying to do the right thing at the end. He was trying to expose corruption, to make amends for his past. And for that, he was murdered by someone who had sworn to protect and serve." She turned to face Claire directly. "You didn't just kill my brother. You killed his chance at redemption, his opportunity to finally be the man he wanted to be. And then you stood in this very courtroom and lied about it. Let everyone believe you were the victim." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours in the case of the state versus Claire Dalton on the charge of murder. In the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. Claire's mother sobbed in the gallery, while reporters frantically typed updates on their phones, but Harris was watching Rex. The German shepherd had lifted his head at the word guilty, his ears pricked forward as if he understood the significance of the moment. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, his tail moved. Just a slight wag, barely perceptible, but unmistakably a sign of satisfaction. Judge Patricia Morrison, the same judge who had presided over Claire's first trial, looked older and more worn as she prepared for sentencing. "Officer Dalton, you have disgraced not only yourself, but the badge you wore. You betrayed the trust of your community, your colleagues, and, perhaps most tragically, your loyal partner who tried desperately to expose your crimes." She paused, looking down at Rex, who sat alert and attentive beside Harris. "In my 30 years on this bench, I've never seen a case where the truth was revealed so clearly by such an unexpected source. This dog's refusal to let injustice stand is a lesson for all of us." Claire was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison as the courtroom cleared. Harris remained seated with Rex at her side. The German shepherd had officially been reassigned to her, a partnership born from tragedy, but built on mutual respect and trust. "You did good, boy," she murmured, stroking his head. You never gave up. Rex looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and Harris could swear she saw understanding there. Not just of what had happened, but of what it meant. Justice had been served, but at the cost of everything Rex had once believed about his handler. Outside, the courthouse reporters clamored for interviews, but Harris pushed through the crowd with Rex at her heel. They had work to do, cases to solve and a trust to rebuild as they reached their patrol car. Harris noticed something that made her smile for the first time in months. Rex was walking with his old confidence, his head high, his step purposeful. The dog, that had been broken by betrayal, had found his way back to duty. Ready to get back to work, partner? Harris asked, as she opened the car door. Rex jumped into the passenger seat and barked once, sharp, clear, and full of determination. It was the sound of a dog who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is refusing to stay silent when your partner is wrong, as they drove away from the courthouse. Harris reflected on the lesson Rex had taught them all. In a world full of lies, manipulation, and betrayal, sometimes the most honest witness is the one who can't speak. But as Rex had proven, the truth doesn't need words. Sometimes it just needs the courage to keep digging until justice is finally unearthed. 6 months later, Rex would receive the Medal of Valor from the police department, becoming the first K-9 in the city's history to be honored for exposing corruption within the force. The ceremony would be attended by officers from departments across the state, all of whom understood the significance of what Rex had accomplished. But that night, as Harris and Rex sat on their porch, watching the sunset, the medal meant less than the simple fact that justice had been served. Rex had refused to let a lie become the truth, even when that lie came from the person he trusted most. In a world where loyalty is often confused with blind obedience, Rex had shown them all the difference between faithfulness and complicity. He had been loyal to something greater than his handler. He had been loyal to the truth. And in the end, that loyalty had spoken louder than any human voice in any courtroom. The dog that wouldn't stay silent had ensured that justice, though delayed, was never truly denied. Sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from those who cannot speak.